All right, so I want to pick up just one thing, and that's the concern about, is America becoming a land of stupos, a bunch of self-satisfied poo flingers running around, much less interested in growing themselves and cultivating themselves than in expressing themselves and making sure that other people know that they too have opinions. I think there's a line that I may have said before. I think it's a William Hazlitt line where he says, "People do not talk for the sake of expressing their opinions. They have opinions for the sake of talking." And the degree to which that is true, I guess it can be seen so much on YouTube. There are so many people who fly little verbal flags of the collectives to which they want to be seen as belonging, and they grab their heart and act all serious about it and get defensive, and they sort of plant feet in positions largely, I think, for ego. We cultivate a sense of individualism, and that individualism is through the expression of it, largely, I guess, through consumer preferences. But that process of expressing one's unique individuality by one's consumer preferences, I think, has become a kind of bullshitting where people know just little surface amounts about things, Google search and Wikipedia entry, and again, this sort of very shallow glancing across the surface range or depth of knowledge about the things that they're talking about. But it's largely because what they're doing is they're putting on the ideas like it's a tie, and they're sort of trying it on and imagining the other is a mirror for them to try to get a look at themselves. I think one of the things that is a concern, and I've noticed this, I spent the last couple of days reading a wonderful book. I'm right now, again, I'm in various books, but the book that I'm really enjoying is Friedrich Kittler's book, Optical Media. I'll see if I can maybe shoot a video on that. A very illuminating book, provocative, interesting. It says a lot to people who want to understand this issue of the new media. But I think one of the things that really came across to me in studying the last couple of days is what kind of intimacy is the act of reading. Like when I'm talking here with you on YouTube, if I'm talking with you, I'm over here, you're over there, and you hear my words and you're already positioned to either agree or disagree. And even if you agree with words that I guess in some way are of another's intonation. I mean, it's sort of like you're listening, and listening is the act by which you claim to either come to agree or disagree, and maybe you level it up to, well, did I understand or not understand? See, I think that would be more sophisticated. I think we tend to just say, well, I disagree or I agree, without really going, well, what am I agreeing or disagreeing with? I mean, do I really understand what the other was saying? What's so interesting, though, is that when you're listening with other people, or when you're talking with other people, as you listen, it's almost like if you're listening very carefully, you allow the other's words to think the thoughts for you. Now, obviously, I mean, you have your own interpretation, and the words, they take on the meanings according to your own history and your own background, and I guess the context in which you heard those words. And there's a lot of factors going on, but there's a sense in which you don't actually repeat the words that you're listening to as you're listening to them. In fact, sometimes, if someone is accused of not listening to you, it's because they were talking to themselves and couldn't hear you because they were too busy listening to themselves. And so I think there is something about genuine listening where you kind of allow the other to think your thought moves along with their words in such a kind of seamless way that you can, I guess, listen to some people. Now, if you disagree with the person and you really find it difficult to understand what they're saying, well, you might keep popping out. It's kind of like the difference between a book that you can get lost in, where you sort of just read and the next thing you know, you're finishing the book, and a book where you're continuously going, is that right? Or the writing is very bad, or the grammar doesn't work, and you sort of get keeping popped out of it, and you set the book down, you go, I need to find a different book or whatever. But I think the more general issue is, when you read, you have to produce the utterances. You have to speak it and then listen to what you just said. See, now when I'm doing a YouTube, or if I go on to YouTube and I listen to someone say something, I maybe have to reproduce their argument if I'm going to say, okay, well, here's their argument, and then I try to lay it out and I put it into my own words. But I don't know the degree to which people are generally doing that. I see a lot of responses where people they rant and they've completely missed the point. They take something out of context. Again, it's like a Three's Company episode. There are other people who use this strategy where they'll play a little bit of the video and then they'll just respond to it. And both of those, they're interesting. I'm not condemning them, but I don't know if they're as useful or as potent in really self-growth and self-cultivation the way that reading is. You know, it's like, again, when I sit down to read, it's as if I have to produce the speech itself in order to then ask myself if I understood what I just said. And that act of going through speech production, I think, is really important. You know, it's like when you listen to people, you can understand what they say, but if you can only understand what they say, but you can't reproduce it, you might as well just be taking a feather and tickling your brain. It's a little brain tickle, but you're not growing those capacities of redistributing and producing what you had heard and learned. It seems as if a kind of speaking and listening, they position us over against one another. And again, when you listen very carefully to someone, closely to someone who you know well, maybe you can get lost in their words and you let their words do your thinking for you. But I don't think that that's maybe the general case. I think that we position ourselves over there. We see the other at a distance from that. But when you take a text, a book, you know, it's like you become the other for a while. There's not really this separation. You know, first, the person who writes the book, they imagine an other as they're writing it. You know, again, a good author especially, they're trying to imagine not themselves as they're producing it. And then the person who comes and reads that, they, I guess, try to imagine that it's what the author means, and that's that. And there is a sense of going, yeah, this is what the author thinks. But in the act of producing the speech, I think the reader is, it's almost like there's an ability or a willingness to entertain a thought as potentially one's own when you read it. Even if you know an author that isn't you wrote that, there's a sense in which I say, well, this kind of could have been my thought. I produced it, at least in my ability to speak it, and then as I thought about it, I make it my own. I don't know the degree to which this happens on YouTube. I don't know. It just seems so much more about flag waving and group identifying and maybe about speaking and listening. I wonder, though, the degree to which syntax, just for example, or grammar, the syntactical maneuvers that one makes as one speaks, the lexicon, I mean, the sheer range of the kinds of words that one brings into play, those seem to be so much more potently cultivatable, harvestable from reading, from literacy. I'm not sure the degree to which talking with one another, and again, speech is important. You know, I think when you go back to the ancient world and you look at the kind of reservations that Socrates had and that Plato had but reluctantly admitted into writing, but even there the writing was in dialogic form, and then you get to Aristotle, and science, you know, really becomes possible. I mean, if narrative and myth are the precursor, right, in the Socrates and Plato, by the time you get to Aristotle, you do get a very scientific attitude. And there is something about, I think, literacy that it has to be embraced, and you have to cultivate it. I think when we're around people, if they use words that we don't know, it can be embarrassing. It's almost irritating. You go, hey, don't use those words, or you're being pretentious. It makes us feel awkward. But when you read a book and the author uses a word you don't know, they're not trying to affront you. Maybe they're trying to be pretentious. I think we want to grant that. But maybe they're trying to be precise. Maybe they're trying to give a nuance. Maybe it's a word that you're unfamiliar with, but you should be familiar with it. I think the more that people believe that you can be sophisticated, very bright, nuanced, and yet have a vocabulary of about 10 words, I think there's something that's misunderstanding there. I mean, there may be different things going on. There may be like an awareness that we want to say all sentience has. Right? I mean, anything that's sentient has a kind of awareness. It's a place and moment of the cosmos. But when we start to move into that kind of intelligence, which is directly growable through social interaction, it just seems like text, literacy, is a kind of, it's like a thin gossamer which we can do a balancing act upon, and we make it from one shore to the other. We become who we're not yet by pretending to be another. There is a growth that can come through reading by a kind of, again, a pretending that the words you're producing were your own to begin with, and then to be astonished at what you hear yourself saying, and then decide whether you believe it or agree with it or disagree with it. It's so different than the positionality that comes when you imagine the other is fully over there. Well, anyway, hope everyone is well. Take care. Bye-bye.